So Rainforest Alliance following a rebranding process. They wanted to change the look of their site and a little bit about how it works. Over the years, they've been producing a ton of content about the work that they do and relating it to other pieces of content. And they really wanted to produce this kind of a related content engine that their viewers, depending on where their viewers were in the site, they could have access to other relevant information. And so this was part of the content model that came out of that kind of reimagination of who they were and what their website should be in terms of communicating that. Since we do the day-to-day support of their site, and we're very interested in Drupal 8 and doing a lot of Drupal 8 work already, we thought this would be a perfect fit for them. We could make it work for right now, and then it would be in place for all of the advancements that are coming with Drupal 8. This is the lobby of their office. That was just kind of a cool picture. That's Bark. So they wanted to build, after doing some consulting, they decided they wanted to build a Drupal 8 website, which would have they have their own web team. So their web team would manage the UX stuff and the quality assurance pieces. And we would build out, Last Call Media would build out the Drupal aspects of it. And they wanted it to be in a launch-ready state by the end of September 2016. The project got kicked off in April, toward the end of April, and it didn't really have a full-blown budget for a product owner to build out the whole entire backlog for this project. So what I did instead was took on kind of the role of an Agile coach, and I coached them, the web team, on building their own backlog, and we met with their team and myself and a subject matter expert from Last Call a couple times a week. The first meeting was just kind of explaining to them like how to basically write a backlog item, write user stories, the concept of a definition of done. And then each meeting, at first it was kind of like, nope, this won't work. This isn't going to work. No, you would want to write this one this way, or pointing out, different pieces about what they had written, how that was or was not going to be useful for the development team. After about, and here's a picture of me joking around at one of the two-day workshops. But after about the fourth meeting, they were really getting the hang of it. And then from there, it would just be looking at what they had written for a backlog item and pointing out where more detail might be needed or where something might be confusing. So each week, it got a little bit better, and they went back over their previous backlog items, and it was really just, coaching them on being better product owners. I think the technical Scrum term for what the role that they were in would have been the business owner term, which on large-scale Scrum projects, you can have the stakeholders and the business owner person who is kind of standing in for the stakeholder, and then that person works with the product owner who is intimate with their development team. And so I played the product owner role in this relationship. So over the period of 1 month, so basically the month of May, I believe, we did those 2 meetings a week, kind of going over their backlog development. It was a shared Google Doc where we built out basically all of the backlog items and the definitions of done of each thing. They were also the designers on this project, so they were doing the designs as well, matching that up with their backlog items. Once the backlog got into a state where it kind of made sense to start sizing each item, we went on site for a 2-day workshop to kind of get a sense of what is this project going to look like across 6 sprints, because the budget was only enough to cover 6 sprints. So the idea was, here's the backlog, and it's going to be a certain amount of work, but we can only spend 6 2-week increments on it. So what are we going to fit into these 2 weeks potentially to have what you want at the end of it? So that really was an effort in terms of making the project vision match and a realistic expectation. So what we did was we had them write the title of each epic in their backlog. So an epic is like a really big story. It's something that's going to get broken down into a number of other stories that will make up that epic. So it's kind of like the biggest bucket of an idea that they could have for each of the things that they wanted their website to do. We wrote down an epic on the back of a note card and kind of did like a collaborative planning poker style sizing exercise where the last call subject matter expert went through each epic note card, and since he was involved in the 2 times a week meeting for backlog development, was familiar with kind of the evolution of these ideas. So on the back of each note card, he kind of wrote his guesstimation sizing, right? So it could have been 40 hours or something, or 80 hours, or 8 hours, right? So he went through and did all of that, and then with the client, what we did was we brought up each epic and said, how big do you think this is? And the first one didn't make sense at all. But after like 3 or 4, they started to get a sense of like, oh, that's a profile page, 8 hours, or that's the display of a content type. That one's 12. They got into a rhythm. And so that was kind of cool, but what was the most cool about that is sometimes you pull up a card and say, okay, this is the display of the home page, and what does everybody think? And they were like, oh, somebody said 4 hours, but the subject matter expert sized it at 60. So it's like, what's the misconception here? So then it would come out like, oh, we thought this page would not do any of that stuff that you were thinking. So we were able to kind of align a little bit better on the sizing of things, or it would go the other way. We would think something is super simple, but they would have guessed it to be huge. And then it would turn out that we found out about a substantial hope that they had not included in the backlog. So we were able to kind of get a sense of all those pieces. Let me just see what my next slide is. Okay, so in building this backlog, I kind of said a bunch of some of this stuff. It was a 100-page Google Doc. We broke it down into epics, and now this is the slide I should have had up with the stuff that I was talking about. Doing that collaborative estimation, we went from that to we took the note cards and piled them up into basically sprint piles. And so a pile was determined to be full when it reached some agreed upon threshold for what we could do during a sprint. So I think the number was 140. So each note card, and the screen is getting the color is getting weird. I'm sorry about that. So we agreed that our sprint team could hit 140 for a development effort. Right, so the sprint was full when the numbers on the back of the card added up to 140. So one of the things that, one of the concepts that this brought into the relationship was that there's only so much time each sprint can get full, right? So we started grouping the cards. This is what we think we should do in the first sprint, and then we had a second pile. This is what we think we should do in the second sprint. And the cards were put into each of their piles under the strategy of not only is this important to the project, but is this going to matter that it's done before other things that we want to do? So we can strategically do things before other things and enable those later things to be done better. So we grouped them into those sprint piles, and we basically were able to make 9 piles of things, but the budget was only 6 piles. This brought in the concept of a backlog that is for after this project, and that was an important one to have because as we were rolling through these sprints, it was the case that we weren't going to be able to do everything that was forecasted, and we had a place for those things to go, already established from the outset that, well, let's move this to the product backlog for after these 6 sprints, we can do it in the future. This whole exercise brought with it the concept of forecasting. So a lot of this stuff is really having the language to manage expectations appropriately. So when you have a forecast about what's going to happen in sprint 6, you're not promising that those things are going to happen in sprint 6. Just like the weather people aren't promising it's going to be sunny next Sunday. So that was important too. We kind of had a good sense of what we're going to accomplish in sprint 1 and maybe sprint 2, but the rest of this stuff is just, realistic guesswork to kind of get a sense of project vision. This is the spreadsheet that came out of that forecasting. So basically you can imagine each one of these was the title on a note card that we group guesstimated with the client. These were we did sizing, just one work unit equaled 1 hour. So there it was. And up at the top there we had the target sizing of 140 and then what the cards added up to. And after this pile, there was just all the other cards. So we thought at the beginning that it would be great to get some of the groundwork, like to get the articles and the videos in place, because later we were going to have the latest, which was going to show those, and related content, which was going to relate them to each other in different ways. So that would be an example of getting this stuff done first to better enable what the future pieces were going to be. All right. So one of the things about Agile is that you kind of end up with these people misusing it, where it's like, well, we're Agile, right? So we can just change what we're doing at any time. And it kind of gets misused in this way that it makes people feel that the plan isn't important, right? But it's not that the plan isn't important. It's that you need to have a plan and you need to always be planning, okay? So we use Scrum on this project, and Scrum is basically a framework for being Agile, where every aspect of Scrum gives you a moment to adjust your plan, gives you a moment to be aware of more things, right? So a plan is only possible you can only plan the things that you're aware of. So you want a structure, a project, a way to do projects where you can constantly become aware of new things as they come up and have a reasonable way to adjust your plan so that you're always going in the right direction, especially if you find out that you might be going in the wrong direction. You want to start going in the right direction. So some pieces of Agile planning that we do on our sprints is we do a pre-sprint grooming meeting, and this is a chance for the dev team and the client team to get together and go through the items in the backlog that are hoped to be included in the sprint, and just to ask questions. And basically, it's the opportunity to optimize the understanding of those backlog items so that you can have the best sprint planning meeting possible, right? So sprint planning happens on the first day of the sprint, typically a Monday, and you don't want to waste an entire day of your first day of your sprint planning. You want to get it planned out and then get to work. So the pre-sprint grooming session is a way to kind of optimize and best enable an effective sprint planning meeting. Sprint planning would happen, and then at the ends of the sprints, we would do what I think can be considered reforecasting. And so this would be a meeting where the development team would be able to come out of the trenches of the project and point and look at the forecast, look at those guesstimates that were made way back at the beginning of the project and say, that one's crazy, that one's probably still okay, that one should be a little bit bigger. And then we can kind of adjust the project vision to match that reality that was coming from the people that were doing the work. We started doing mid-sprint releases and the mid-sprint releases became increasingly important as the project went on, because as the client started to feel like they were running out of time, since they only had 6 sprints, it was important to give them a visibility into what was being accomplished and what was challenging, so that they would have a chance to be agile themselves and adjust what they thought was important and when it was going to get done. Here's a picture of us in a daily stand-up. This looks different if you're distributed. The Scrum team on this all happened to work in one location, so they were able to use a Scrum board with stickies. If this is possible to do for you, it's fun to do. I think it's fun. Here's that Scrum board. So you have it almost looks like a Trello board, right? Trello can do this kind of thing, but people can physically own their stickies and move them around. Kind of an old school way to do it. Yep.
So was it like at the top you had epics and at the stories underneath it?
Yeah, so one non-academic Scrum thing about this is these were the forecast, the stickies that came from the forecast, and this was the Scrum team wanted to do this just to kind of maintain project vision, just to kind of keep a sense of what might be coming down the pipe and to help them know or think about how they're going to do stuff. So these are the epics, and when they're doing them in a current sprint, they get put over to here. So this is basically like the accepted sprint backlog for a sprint. And these are the epics broken out into stories. And then these would sometimes get broken out into subtasks if it made sense to do. And then as people chose to do them, they would go underneath the person's name. As they got done, would get kicked over to someone in a review state, and either going back and forth between doing and review, they would eventually get done. And eventually all the stickies will all be clustered over here to be archived at the end of the sprint. And each one of those stickies would represent an item in this sprint backlog, which was a spreadsheet. And each item in this sprint backlog was a clickable link to the exact heading in the project backlog, which described the definition of done and had links to the different visuals for the project. One thing that I like to do for openness, which is a Scrum value, is a product journal shared with the client team, and this is to give them visibility into, I would track the daily stand-ups, I would track which stories were completed, and when a story would be completed, I would award those points to another spreadsheet. And I would use that spreadsheet for a chart, for a build-up chart. I think I have a picture of a build-up chart. I'm trying to think if I had anything I wanted to say about this. But it was nice to, another thing I tracked in here. So each daily stand-up, people say what they're working on, what they're going to work on next, and where they're stuck. And so I was able to track what each of the sticking points were on a day-to-day basis and how we resolved them. And this came in handy later when I'd have to go back a couple times to see, like, how did we decide to fix something or change something, or maybe the client changed their mind, or maybe we were flexible in the middle of a sprint and swapped out one task for another. It was important to be able to go back and see what had happened. This is the project build-up chart from the project. I think build-up charts are really interesting. They can tell the story of a project pretty well. Like, one of the things you can tell from this build-up chart is you can see these dips to completion at the end of you can see each sprint, right? You kind of have this like belly. This is indicative of a new build where substantial pieces, big pieces of core functionality are being worked on, right? So if you've got a big task, it's going to take you almost the whole sprint before it becomes shippable. And so it's not until you start running out of time that you either cut those corners that you were looking to cut, or you tie up those loose ends and get it into a shippable state, and then you can get those points awarded. And that kind of have these initial sprints of a big reveal. And you can kind of tell that after sprint 5, kind of a very distinguishable change where all that core functionality was basically in place, and we were able to get into more of a just polishing up the sprint a little bit. I think I'm leaving something out, but I'll add that on lastcallmedia.com's website, I did a full case study of this. So it tracks the presentation pretty well. I think it came out pretty good. So it might read better than me being up here talking. Sprint 1, we accepted all the forecasted, the wish list of forecasted stories and epics. And then basically the sprint goal was to get the base site set up for the calls to action, the article, and video content entry. And if anybody has any questions along the way, like some people have, it definitely could be a discussion. I don't dig in too much into the specific Drupal pieces, so if anybody has any questions about that, just throw them out there. But I will say that so we did a pattern library on this site, and that was basically like this is what this type of, like for example, a specific type of call to action looks like this. A certain type of heading looks like this other thing. This is how a menu would look, and whenever we use this side menu type thing, and then all the different layouts would reference those patterns. So by the end, by sprint 6, we were able to fix kind of seemingly site-wide issues by fixing a single pattern. So the whole site was pulling from a single pattern from the pattern library. So that was kind of cool. That wasn't a specific Drupal thing.
I have a question on this. So curious to see site performance in sprint 1.
That's a guess. That's a good. All right. So they had basically note cards for those things, and since those things are kind of like a general concern across the whole project. So actually, I'm glad you brought that up. These bottom 3, site performance, responsiveness, and taxonomy, whatever the taxonomy is going to be, was just the client thought that was important, and so it ended up on a note card, and so we wanted to put it into a pile, and then once it was in a pile, it ended up on the spreadsheet, and we were just kind of keeping track of it. But this is just basically saying like, yep, we'll consider this. So there wasn't like a full-blown thing that we did for any of these 3. These were just a consideration. Yeah, so definitely good to bring up there. We got a little bit more setup done, kind of broke into a couple of future stories, so that's why we were able to kind of blow past the target on this one, but that's not uncommon for getting a lot of the groundwork in place. Sprint 2 still stayed pretty much on track. The goal was to build out the latest, which is something that uses Apache Solr backend. And we polished up the article and video content types from the previous iteration. But this one was a big one for getting Apache Solr in place, integrated in with Drupal. You can also see at the bottom, I have one of these. At the bottom, we started having stories that were not completed all the way, so there was a little bit of work in progress that wasn't complete. That we tried to accomplish. So you can kind of see some of this stuff, some of the corners, some of the technical debt kind of getting dragged as early as Sprint 2. Can't even read that on the screen, but the planning meeting for Sprint 2, a note from that is that it turned out that the latest listing, the Apache Solr piece, was going to be a bigger deal than was forecasted. So the subject matter experts guesstimate on how challenging it would be to do this listing and work with Apache Solr was underestimated a little bit. But it seemed that the related content and image functionality of those epics were going to be easier. So it kind of balanced out. It turned out that it looked like we were going to have additional capacity, so what we decided to do rather than add in a story from a future sprint was to clean up a little bit of that technical debt from Sprint 1. So technical debt, by around Sprint 3, we started to get a little bit concerned with it. We didn't really get to as much of the Sprints 1 technical debt as we wanted to, and Sprint 2 came with its own technical debt. So you can see there was a decision made in Sprint 3's planning to only do certain things, right? So you can see in the forecasted, the wish list of items for Sprint 3 had these sections not in bold about contact us, landing page, impact dashboard. This is an example of it hitting sprint planning and the team wouldn't commit to these, and that's okay. That's part of Scrum and part of agility, part of recognizing what reality is. The team did not feel comfortable with these getting done in this sprint, and so they weren't committed to. They got moved on the sprint forecast. They got moved to a later sprint. So here's the forecasted stories. Here's the accepted stories. A lot fewer. So sprint 3 was a little bit stressful for the client, right? Because the client wants to see everything happening in a certain order. The client at this point is thinking, well, when are you gonna do these things? So it's a little bit stressful, and we'll talk a little bit about where that comes out eventually in a project. So sprint 3 was forecast as a really full sprint, and the team decided to only accept the stories that were shown on those previous slides to make sure that there would be time to completely wrap up. So they recognized the fact that the way things were kind of hoped for was adding up to technical debt from cutting corners. And so it's time, and so to react to that, the right path forward is to do things in a way where you can clean things up better and avoid creating more of those loose ends. So Sprint 3 wrapped up with fewer stories committed to, but the results were, I felt, and we had a really great review with the client, that the results were beyond excellent, and there was very little technical debt going forward from this point. And here's a picture of some of that, some of that back-end work that they did. This is a close-up of I believe, a panelizer panel and some of the editorial experience where they can edit kind of like a little bit from the outside in aspect, dragging things around. And here is panelizer, which got started to get put in place, and they could edit what was on each landing page. So just to give you some visuals at this point. So after that, thinking about how we had to not commit to all the things hoped for in Sprint 3, and we moved right into Sprint 4, we decided, well, let's reconfigure this forecast, right? So let's reassess how this project is going. What are we accomplishing? What's left to accomplish? We looked back at that spreadsheet. We looked at the actual development team, having been working on things, re-estimated the remaining epics to override the subject matter experts' guesses from, at this point, I guess 6 weeks ago. And so we ended up moving some of the epics closer to happen in sprints. They had a couple of pretty big deal items that we had forecasted for Sprint 5 and 6. And so when they saw that, or when we all saw that we had to bump some big items out of Sprint 3, they saw, well, we want to avoid the situation where we get to Sprint 6 and we have to bump it to, after launch, because they didn't want to launch without it. So they we all agreed, we worked together to move those things from 5 and 6 to Sprints 4 and 5. And some things they removed entirely. So one of the cool things about this is to experience people's flexibility. All right, so there were things in this project. At first, when you start the project, everything's important. Nothing can get bumped. We have to get everything done, right? And so when I was in that kind of agile coaching role, working through their backlog, I would look for places to say, this thing you might want to push this out to the future as instead of a requirement, let's make this a nice to have. And at first, everything was a requirement. And so an example of one of the things, like the types of things that I would call out, the first one that I came across in this project was a load more button. And so this is the idea that you get to the end of the list of things that you want to look at, and there's this load more button. And I said, well, Drupal's going to come with a pager, so this might be a nice to have. Nope, the load more button's really important. They said, well, what about infinite scroll? Would it be easier to do if it were infinite scroll? And nope, it wouldn't be easier if it was infinite scroll. But I just want to call that out. These things, it seems like a small thing, but these things add up. So when we got into that sprint forecasting, and the load more buttons for all the lists had its own epic card, and they started to see how there were only 6 piles, but not all the cards were going to fit in all the 6 piles. That load more button was one of the first to go. Like, all right, forget it. We can do pagers. We want to have room to do the things that are really important. So when we did this reforecasting, it was also that case where, okay, well, we want more room to do a better job at the things that are really important. So now we've reconsidered it. This one, we don't even have to do this one anymore. Things were like, this section doesn't even exist on our current site, so no one's going to miss it. Let's not even do this. Where at the beginning of the whole thing, we said we were going to do an events section. We have to do it. It became this section. This, no one's going to miss this. Let's make more room. So it's incredibly collaborative and realistic and sustainable, right? You don't end up in this situation where we got you to guess that you were going to do this, and now it's not possible. We want you to do it anyway, and we don't want to pay for it if it takes too long. You kind of get out of that whole thing, which I think is not sustainable at all, especially on large projects. My last little note there is, so we have an ongoing support relationship with them, and they have an ongoing support budget. So we thought with them, and actually it was their idea, well, what if we just passed some tasks to the support team, right? So we tried having the support team do some of this cleanup stuff. It ended up seeming it wasn't like a big win because the support team wasn't as familiar with the work with this project. So it was kind of like an onboarding thing, kind of a diminishing returns type of situation. But we tried it. So Sprint 4 had the forecasting goal, which was a number of landing pages and content types. And so you can see this is kind of, what this says to me is that what you think is going to happen is not what makes sense to do by the time you get to that future state. So it made sense to do a completely different goal, which was a little bit more iteration on some of the content types. And they moved this certified products and support us landing pages closer because those were much more important. So they reprioritized based on the reality that things were going to take a little bit longer than everyone had hoped. So here's a little bit of difference. So the forecasted stories and the accepted stories, completely different. Ended up with the concept of a stretch goal where something was maybe going to get done. And so a stretch goal is that we're not committing to this, but we'll try. So that's an example of the team's focus on careful commitment by not committing to that stretch goal, but just saying that it would be a stretch goal. And just like with Sprint 3, there was not really any technical debt left over, and they delivered on the stretch goal, which nudged them just above the target, which you can't really see, but it is just, huh? So whenever if you're trying to complete some piece of functionality and you cut corners to do it by a certain time, those corners are like loose ends, or you might sweep them under the rug, or maybe it looks and works right, but it's not exactly how you would have liked to have done it if you had more time. And so that's a piece of technical debt that you will have to pay back later. Yeah, at some point you're going to have all these nasty little cut corners everywhere that were fine for a minimum viable product, but once can actually spring back up later and be the reason why some new piece of functionality is going to be so hard to do, because there's this gross loose end that didn't matter in the past. It's driving me nuts how awful this screen is. Yeah. I don't know if we just have to hit it. I know it looked better when I took the input out and put it back in. See, it looks good right now.
Somebody put a technical debt there.
Yeah, right. So the idea of iteration, right? So taking something that was done to a certain extent and then making it a little bit better. in a next level of effort, in a next bit of effort, is making a new iteration on that thing. So if you're thinking about like a mode of transportation, one iteration might be a roller skate, the next iteration might be a scooter, and the next iteration might be a car. That's what you're supposed to do with Scrum projects. With a completely new build, it can be harder to get true iteration because you're building out such big pieces of functionality in the first few sprints. Sprint 5, I think, looking back in hindsight, we could have really done in more of a iterative piece where we're polishing up more pieces. I think we had the opportunity to do that. Most of the core functionality was in place in the previous sprints, and it would have been possible to do more of the, the bugs that were coming up from QA during Sprint 5. We didn't take this opportunity. We're feeling pretty good about ourselves, and we took the goals that came out of the reforecasting, and we just accepted them, and we just went about our business, and we just did Sprint 5 as we thought it should be done previously, rather than. We didn't catch the fact that we could have done a more iterative Sprint 5 than what we had planned. So here were the stories. The certified products is a big piece of functionality. The listing is a really big deal. It's got a lot of functionality in it. And so these are the ones that they bumped forward from Sprint 6. So those were what were forecasted, and we just accepted the same ones. And we technically crushed it. I think that we accomplished all those things, and we were feeling great about it. And so here you can see this is the end of Sprint 5. We got another little story done there, and we were feeling great. Oh yes. So basically, we just followed the same forecast. We did some big piece of functionality. We got the stuff done there. We technically crushed it, but another aspect of projects kind of sprung up. Okay, so actually let me go back to this piece. So right here in Sprint 3, when we weren't able to do all of the originally forecasted stories, and we had a smaller delivery, and there were some regressions, and the technical debt was building up, even though we stayed on target for Sprint 4 and 5, the damage had been done. The development was still, things were incomplete. There were little bugs, and there was a few things we weren't able to get to. And at this moment, some doubt started to creep in. So we started to get into this emotional life cycle or emotional cycle of a project that happens. And the idea of an emotional cycle is that when you start a project, there's this honeymoon period of optimism and certainty that we made the right decisions, we hired the right people, everything's going to go great, and things are going pretty great, and nothing really wrong has happened yet. And then there's this moment in every project where things get a little tough, maybe some things go wrong, and doubt starts to creep in, okay? And so the idea is that good project teams will find a way to detect when this is happening and get from doubt to hope as quickly as possible, with as little emotional damage as possible. Okay? And if we overlay, that's why I put this back in here. So it started to creep in here, and right around here, we had a call with the client where they were very, very concerned about a number of things, and we just had to work with them on and kind of reprioritize how things are going and hear out their concerns and give them feedback from the project, how things were going. And you can see if you consider this chart, you've got optimism, everything's going great. Doubt starts to creep in here. That's interesting. So getting from doubt to hope quickly on this project, I think, was a dedication to the 5 Scrum values, followed by a little bit of a change in how we were doing the work. We ended up doing what was possible in Sprint 5, we ended up doing in Sprint 6, but I'll talk a little bit about the Scrum values. So Scrum has 5 values: commitment, focus, respect, openness, and courage. And so some of what happens when you get into a pessimistic, doubtful state is there can be some kind of disrespectful comments made, like the client will be concerned that you're not getting enough done because you're not doing as good as you could or something, or you're not paying attention to the details, or you're being sloppy, or you're being this or that. A respectful understanding of that situation would be, we know you're doing the best you can, so let's look at what happened in this project that, in reality made it so that we couldn't get to all this stuff. Let's be realistic about what we're getting to or what we're not able to get to. And so that kind of helps frame the conversation. Like, it's not the case that we were just, joking around and barbecuing when we could have been doing this homepage. That's not why the homepage had to get bumped from sprint 3 to sprint 4. It's really just like, let's be respectful and talk about what is going on with this project where, we can't get to everything. Why are we running out of time? What are we trying to do? Maybe we're trying to do too much each sprint. How can we do less? And then open to make sure that there is openness. So my product owner journal was an example of openness in the project. So that was helpful to be able to go back and go through all these things, and because all of that stuff was shared to bring everybody, the client team and our team, have them all have access to everything that's happening at all times, is an aspect of that openness, so that everybody's aware of as much as possible and everybody was there when it was happening. So everybody can kind of understand that we're all just trying, and we were the chosen team to do this project, and we're all just trying to do it. In reality at this time, when we ended up kind of hitting this, this is actually the valley from doubt to hope, is often called the groan zone, right? Every project has its groan zone. And I've come to accept the fact that having a groan zone is just an indicator that you're trying to do as much on a project that you should be trying to do, right? Like, how do you know that you're doing as much as you possibly could if you never hit that point where there's some things you don't have time to do, right? So the pessimism comes from having to realize the fact that there are some things that you originally hoped for that you're not going to be able to get to. So there's some things that we're not going to be able to do in this project that we hoped we were going to be able to get to, and then there's like, oh, we're not going to be able to do everything, we're not going to complete this project on time. This pessimism starts creeping in. But that just means you've hit the point where we're doing as much as we can. And let's accept that. Let's be real about that. If we're doing as much as we can, how do we shift the remaining priorities so that we get the right things done given our velocity by the end of the project? And once you start to accept that reality, that's when you can start getting hopeful about it. Like, all right, we're not going to be able to get everything done. What can we get done? What are the right things to do? And we start moving up to the hope there. So this piece you can see, or maybe you can't, is very closer to the line here. And this is when, so we started doing, we released, I have this on a later slide. All right, sorry. I want to do this slide. So some of our challenges in this project. Design specs versus stories. Okay, so they, the web team, they had designed a lot of different design specs. Their design specs were in, they had PSD comps, they had InVision, links to InVision files. They had 2 different UI kit locations. And I didn't force them to standardize on one specific thing because the Agile Manifesto has this value of collaboration over tools, and so I just wanted them to get their stuff done so we could know what we had to do. But when it got to the point where it surfaced during the groan zone that not everything was exactly to spec on any given one of the designs, right? And so it came out that, well, the development team doesn't estimate spec. The development team is estimating functionality as outlined in the user stories. So the design spec is kind of, this is the perfection that we're heading toward, but all we're committing to and accomplishing are the user stories. So that was an important challenge to overcome. It was also important to keep the pixel pushing in check. So if you put something out as an iteration and you just kind of pixel push it to perfection, that's not really another effort for another version of that. You're getting in the way of your own iteration. So that was something that we had to keep in check. Also what came up was who pays for this technical debt, right? And so I don't know if anybody's been on a project where, bugs happen and you just somehow, for some reason, owe these bugs to the client. So a realistic Scrum project is just, technical debt happens in reality and it becomes part of a future sprint, which means that there's things in future sprints that you can't do. So this was a big thing to accept for anyone who hadn't accepted it, that technical debt happens and it's making it so we can't have everything we want. So kudos to anyone who can swallow that one. But I think that's just reality. The hippo meltdown is, I don't know, does anybody know what a hippo is? Highest paid person's opinion. They typically don't have the time to be involved in the reality of the day-to-day. And so when things start looking drastically different from what was hoped at the outset, this is extremely traumatic. And so knowing that that's a likely thing to happen will help you be prepared for it. Been talking a lot about Agile ways and Scrum values. We talked about respect. Another Scrum value is commitment. You have to fully understand what it is you're committing to before you commit to it, and that's part.
You mentioned 5 points of commitment, focus, and respect.
Focus, you want to protect your focus. You don't want, if your focus is interrupted, that's going to jeopardize your commitments. So you need to be empowered to commit and empowered to protect your focus on your commitments. So if there is a overbearing product owner coming in, telling you to do different things all the time throughout your sprint, you need to, as a member of the dev team, you need to be empowered to say, hey, this is breaking my focus and jeopardizing my commitment because I've committed to this thing and I'm committing to having a shippable version of it done by the end of the sprint. I need to not have my focus broken. And as a product owner, you need to be mindful of getting in the way and breaking people's focus. Focus is really important. And then, so openness, commitment, focus, respect, and courage. Courage is just having the courage to stand up for your focus, having the courage to expect respect, right? And I understand, in the collaborative context, I understand respect as accepting that someone is doing the best they can, right? So I accept you're doing the best you can. I don't think you're just jerking around. So what can I do to help you do better?
In the teams that I've been on, once the sprints were successful, the players their courage level grew, but then so did the stakeholders. Mm-hmm. They became more confident about their own future because they had a methodology that they could get a handle on what they wanted, what was possible, and what actually happened.
Yeah.
And when those started to become a common reality, it was very productive for everybody.
Oh, definitely. Becoming a well-formed team. If the values are adhered to consistently, trust builds, right? So trust is kind of what you earn from following consistent values. Sometimes people want to say that trust should be the 6th value, but I don't think trust is necessarily a value. I think it's something that you earn from following the 5.
You can't just say I trust you.
Right.
It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that I saw a study where it shows that multitasking, 2 tasks, would reduce the productivity by 40%.
Yeah.
So that goes into the focus.
That is true. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't. You can only pay attention to one thing at a time. There, yeah. Yeah, you can't be switching tasks. And multitasking, I think, is not really a thing. Yeah.
I once tried doing 2 projects at the same time.
It's very frustrating. Very, very frustrating, especially in software development where things are complicated and you need to focus and you're solving this very complicated problem. To be interrupted in the middle of that is extremely frustrating.
But actually, it's not just applicable to just a Scrum team, but you see in a lot of organizations, there are like 10 different initiatives going on. They're competing for people's priorities, But couldn't you do that like in a sequence, then you could have, written much faster and spend less money?
I consulted with a company where they were having a problem with Scrum, and I found out that they didn't have a Scrum Master and they had 2 product owners, which is like, and the answer is you guys aren't doing Scrum. This is not Scrum's problem. You can't have like 2 product owners with competing backlogs, competing over a team. So how did we fix it? In addition to kind of maintaining Scrum values and with the client and talking about things in terms of what's reality. Did I have that? Oh yeah. So reality always wins, right? Reality's going to win. That's what before I left this slide, I want to say reality wins, right? But you need to be on its team, right? You need to recognize reality and be real, right? Reality doesn't always end up being what you want it to be, but you've got to adapt to reality, and that's agility. So in addition to all that, we changed our forecasted goal, which was kind of some remaining content types, listings, and some landing pages, to just prepare for launch, right? So we need to know which things need to be shippable, so we went kind of into a QA sprint a little bit. And we did so that was true iteration every few days. Every little thing that we did, every time we accomplished a story, we released it. And so we did several releases during this last sprint. And every release, they were able to give feedback on it, and we would roll that feedback into the sprint as part of like an ongoing QA element to Sprint 6, and release that back out each time. This was where the pattern library was a huge win, because a lot of the stuff that they were getting really pessimistic and doubtful of would be a tiny little bug in one of the patterns, but it would across the whole site make the whole site look a little bit broken. So a lot of these little patterns were at an iteration of themselves where they needed to be polished up a little bit. So we related they reported all their bugs that they could find, and so if a particular piece of a page didn't look right, that was because it didn't look right in a pattern. And so that pattern was also going to show in one of the stories for Sprint 6. So if when implementing that story in Sprint 6, you could also fix this affected pattern, that fix affected that pattern everywhere else that it showed up on the site. So across Sprint 6, doing the stories in this way, and by fixing things through the pattern library and releasing it quickly, they got to see it. They got to see, wow, the site is just completely coming together like immediately, and they got very hopeful and turned right around. And I think we could have done this in Sprint 5, but we waited till Sprint 6. And
I like that part of your methodology, because in our teams we tended to release after, we'd get everything done by 80% of the way through the sprint.
Yep.
Then we'd clean it up and then we'd release it.
Yep.
But that meant the stakeholders didn't see anything at all for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
That's a long time for them to.
Yeah, and so and for this project, release wasn't released to production. It was released to like stakeholder viewable, because this was a redesign. So it was going to have to get to a certain state, and then the whole thing was going to get to production. So
were the releases available to the stakeholders?
The Rainforest Alliance web team was as close as we got to stakeholders. So they were kind of in a business owner role. The stakeholders just trust them to get it done how they want to get it done. Yeah. So they were essentially the stakeholders.
So for the clients, observers.
Yep.
And they could then report back, okay, look, things are coming up.
Yep. And that basically, the reason why that's so great is it increases awareness, like you're saying, they get to see it. Increasing awareness increases agility, because the more you're aware, the more you can respond to change. And I know we're pretty much out of time. So I basically said that they were released and reviewed as they were completed, and that helped. And so across Sprint 6, we basically got all the bug fixes and like training and all the little stuff out of the way, so that when we did that final review, there were no critical issues, 3 moderate ones. The review was kind of anticlimactic, where it was just like, here's everything. And they're like, we just have 3 questions. How do we change this over here? How do we change this over there? It was just basic support questions, and it went really great. You can check out the site at rainforestalliance.org, and here's some finished pictures. Came out really good. Basically out of time, but thanks everybody for coming. Thank you. It's a dash, rainforest-alliance.org. And I actually have to run. Thank you.